It began as a dream, carved in marble and gold, a dream of divine blood, untouched by common veins, unspoiled by the hands of peasants. In the glittering courts of Europe, centuries before the modern world began to breathe, kings and queens were not merely rulers. They were living gods, guardians of sacred lineages that claimed to descend from heaven itself. Theirs was a world where the purity of blood mattered more than the purity of heart, where marriages were not made for love, but for lineage, and where the greatest danger to a throne came not from war, but from within, from the very blood that was supposed to sustain it. This is the story of history's most inbred women, royal daughters born to cousins, nieces born to uncles, brides bound to brothers, each a living experiment in the fatal art of keeping bloodlines pure. Their faces were painted on palace ceilings, their portraits hung in gilded frames, their lives whispered about in the candlelight of distant courts. But behind those jeweled crowns lay a curse, one that no empire, no amount of power could ever undo. It began in the heart of Europe with the mighty Habsburg dynasty. For centuries, they ruled an empire so vast it was said the sun never set upon it. Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, all fell beneath their rule. But their real empire was the one that flowed through their veins, the House of Habsburg, bound together by blood thicker than reason. They believed that divine power ran through their family, and to dilute it with outsiders would offend God himself. So they married their own. Cousins wed cousins, uncles took nieces. The royal blood was kept pure, and with every generation, that purity grew more poisonous. One of its most tragic daughters was Margaret Teresa of Spain, whose golden hair and porcelain skin masked the fragile truth of her birth. She was the daughter of an uncle and a niece, both from the same house, both bearing the same cursed blood. Born into the Spanish court in 1651, Margaret was destined from birth to serve as a pawn in her family's genetic chessboard. Her father, King Philip IV, saw her not as a child, but as a diplomatic bridge, a vessel to preserve alliances, even if it meant condemning her to the same fate that haunted generations before her. Her face, immortalized by the painter Velázquez in Las Meninas, became an icon of royal innocence. But behind those soft brown eyes was a girl born into decay. Her jawline carried the unmistakable shadow of her lineage, the Habsburg chin, that jutting unnatural deformity that became the dynasty's cruel signature. It was not simply a feature, it was a symbol of centuries of intermarriage. The Habsburgs had bred themselves into a corner, a genetic tomb built from pride and superstition. Margaret was married at 14 to her maternal uncle, Emperor Leopold I, her own father's nephew. The marriage was celebrated with fireworks, processions, and golden wine. But beneath the surface, her body struggled. The union of uncle and niece brought together two lines already warped by generations of inbreeding. The child who should have been a bridge between empires became instead a reflection of their decline. Margaret bore 4 children. Only one survived infancy. She herself died before turning 22, her body frail, her bloodline exhausted. Yet the court called it divine will. They did not see the curse, they worshipped it. To them, purity was worth any price, and that price would soon come due in her nephew, Charles II of Spain, the final Habsburg ruler whose monstrous deformities would end an empire. But the story of history's most inbred women did not end in Spain. It spread like a sickness across Europe through courts that watched the Habsburgs with envy, yet imitated their marriages with devotion. In France, the Bourbons followed suit. In Egypt, the Ptolemies had long perfected the art. Centuries before the Habsburgs, Cleopatra herself had married her brother to preserve their royal blood. To modern minds, it seems unthinkable, but to them, it was divine duty. The gods had married their siblings, so would the children of the gods. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, was both queen and sister wife, a woman born into a dynasty where blood was both sacred and suffocating. Her lineage was already thin from generations of sibling unions. Historians believe that the Ptolemies, originally Greek, had lost their distinct features by the time of Cleopatra, their faces pale and elongated, their health fragile, their sanity often unstable. Cleopatra herself, though immortalized as a beauty, carried the strain of her ancestors' choices. Her family's obsession with purity produced heirs who were both divine and doomed, children born not of love, but of calculation. She ruled over a land collapsing under the weight of its own mythology, and when she took her own life, the dynasty ended not just in tragedy, but in extinction, a fitting end to a bloodline that believed itself immortal. Yet the curse persisted. In the centuries that followed, the daughters of Europe's thrones continued to pay the price for their father's pride. Among them was Maria Anna of Austria, another Habsburg princess who married her uncle, Ferdinand III, in 1631. Her story was one of quiet suffering. A woman trapped in a cage of velvet and gold, her body used to keep the dynasty unbroken. She, too, bore the Habsburg jaw, the sign of royal deformity disguised as grace, and as her descendants spread across Europe, so too did the invisible poison in their blood. Generations of queens, Spanish, Austrian, Neapolitan, carried this legacy, their faces increasingly similar, their health increasingly fragile. But perhaps the cruelest irony was that this obsession with purity was born of fear. Fear of losing power, fear of mingling with those deemed lesser. The very thing they tried to preserve became the seed of their ruin. By the 18th century, the once glorious House of Habsburg was haunted by infertility, madness, and disease. The women of the family became symbols of fragility, pale, sickly, yet always painted as paragons of virtue. Each portrait was an illusion, beauty painted over decay. Take Maria Antoinette of Spain, who was married off to the French Dauphin to cement an alliance between two inbred houses. She was sweet, intelligent, and devout, yet cursed by the same hereditary afflictions that had destroyed her ancestors. Her health declined rapidly. She miscarried repeatedly, her body unable to carry life. The doctors whispered prayers over her corpse at 21, calling her death the will of God. But in truth, it was the will of men who refused to learn. The portraits of these women still hang in museums, serene, graceful, radiant, but the truth behind their beauty is grotesque. They were sacrifices to the altar of pride, and the world that celebrated their purity never mourned their suffering. Imagine a court where a girl is born, and before she learns to speak, her marriage is already arranged, not to a stranger, but to her cousin. Her future is written in bloodlines and treaties. Her worth is measured by how closely her veins match the king's. That was the fate of nearly every royal woman from Vienna to Madrid, from Lisbon to Naples. They were born into power, yet powerless. Their wombs were battlegrounds, their blood a currency. In the name of purity, they gave birth to madness. Their children were stillborn, blind, or deranged, and yet the chronicles called them divine. Behind the silks and sapphires, there were screams no one heard. The queen who convulsed through childbirth, the princess who prayed for death before her wedding night, the empress who lost all her children before her own 20th year. Their stories were scrubbed clean from history's surface, but not from its bones. Every dynasty that practiced this ritual of purity eventually crumbled, not from wars or revolts, but from within. Their genealogies became circular, their blood too tired to sustain life, and through it all, the women were the ones who paid the price. They bore the curse, literally. The men wrote treaties, the women bore consequences. The story of inbred women is not just a tale of science or genetics. It is a tale of arrogance, of how civilizations destroy their own future in the name of legacy. Each generation believed itself divine, and each generation decayed a little more. The faces of these women, once worshipped as symbols of divine grace, became mirrors reflecting humanity's oldest sin, the lust for control. For when kings tried to play gods, they forgot that even gods bleed. And so the royal bloodlines of Europe, once rivers of power, began to dry into puddles of weakness. In their quest for immortality, they bred their own extinction. The women, the queens, princesses, duchesses, were both vessels and victims, adored and destroyed by the same system that crowned them. Behind every portrait of a smiling royal bride was a story of pain, deformity, and death. And though history painted them in gold, their true legacy was crimson, the blood that betrayed them, and the curse that no crown could cure. By the time the 18th century dawned, Europe's royal courts shimmered like mirrors, reflecting the same pale faces. Generations of cousin marriages had turned once diverse dynasties into genetic echoes of themselves. Every coronation looked familiar. Every bride resembled the last. Beneath the powdered wigs and silken gowns lay bodies breaking under invisible inheritance. The daughters of empires, trained from birth to smile, curtsy, and conceive, became living symbols of a civilization devouring its own future. Among them was Maria Carolina of Austria, sister to Marie Antoinette, sent to Naples to secure a political alliance. She carried the same Habsburg blood, the same long chin, the same frailty masked by ceremony. To the crowds, she appeared radiant. To her physicians, she was a catalog of miscarriages, migraines, and melancholy. Letters she wrote to her mother described nights of fever and fear, of praying not for heirs but for relief from the pain that came with each pregnancy. Yet her worth was measured by the number of children she could bear, not the tears she shed. Each birth was another throw of loaded dice, each child a fragile experiment of nature stretched to its limit. Across the Channel, the British monarchy watched these continental unions with both fascination and dread. The Hanoverians, too, dabbled in cousin matches, believing that shared lineage would prevent betrayal. But even there, whispers grew. Too much of the same blood breeds weakness. Physicians began to suspect what priests refused to admit, that divine blood could rot like any other. Science was awakening, but superstition still ruled the throne. The women had no choice but to obey. Then came Maria Antonia Josepha Joanna, better known as Marie Antoinette, the jewel of Austria offered to France. She was the product of generations of careful interbreeding meant to preserve alliances, not humanity. Her beauty hid the same structural weakness of bone and nerve that haunted her line. History remembers her for decadence, for diamonds and cakes, but beneath Versailles chandeliers, she suffered in silence, enduring miscarriages, stillbirths, and the endless scrutiny of a nation hungry for her failure. When she mounted the guillotine in 1793, the blade did not just end a queen, it severed a bloodline centuries in the making. The crowd cheered. The curse had claimed another. While Europe burned in revolution, the old houses clung to their illusions. In Spain, the descendants of Charles II tried desperately to mask the damage. The Bourbon-Habsburg merger continued the cycle, cousin to cousin, niece to uncle, as though the world had learned nothing. One tragic figure was Isabella II of Spain, a queen thrust into power as a child, surrounded by scheming relatives, pressured to marry her own cousin. Her reign was marked by scandal and sickness. The palace was a battlefield of genetics and gossip. She gave birth to 13 children. Half were sickly, several stillborn. Doctors whispered about degeneration of the royal stock, but to question the practice was treason. The church still preached that purity was godly, yet the God they served seemed to have turned away. Further east, in the glittering court of Vienna, Empress Elizabeth, known as Sisi, married her own cousin, Emperor Franz Joseph. Sisi's beauty and charisma dazzled Europe, but behind her myth was a woman tormented by the suffocating traditions of inbreeding and control. Her children suffered from depression and frail health. Her son Rudolph's tragic suicide at Meierling would later symbolize the spiritual decay of the entire empire. Sisi herself became obsessed with perfection, her body, her hair, her image, perhaps sensing that beneath the surface her blood carried too much memory of decay. The Habsburg dynasty was entering its twilight, its heirs dying young, its daughters buried in silks before 30. But the curse of blood purity was not confined to Europe. In the Ottoman Empire, royal marriages among close kin were veiled behind the harem's walls. The sultan sought to keep power contained to prevent foreign influence. Yet, even within those scented chambers, the same laws of nature prevailed. Fragile infants, erratic rulers, and secret burials in the palace gardens whispered of a sickness that no prayer could cure. From Istanbul to St. Petersburg, the pattern repeated. Power feared dilution more than disease. By the 19th century, the new language of science began naming what centuries of superstition had refused to see. Terms like consanguinity and hereditary defect entered royal correspondence. Yet even as doctors warned, kings ignored. Pride was stronger than evidence. The result was a generation of women whose bodies bore the full price of ancestral stubbornness. Princess Charlotte of Belgium, for instance, married her cousin Maximilian of Austria. She adored him, but their union produced no heirs. After his execution in Mexico, she descended into madness, living the rest of her life in seclusion, convinced that mirrors whispered and furniture breathed. Her doctors called it grief. History might call it the echo of tainted inheritance. The 20th century dawned with the same irony that had haunted the 16th. The thrones built on pure bloodlines began to crumble. The Russian Romanovs, related by cousinhood to nearly every European house, watched their empire collapse under the weight of revolution. Tsarina Alexandra, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, carried a mutation for hemophilia, the royal disease that turned minor wounds into death sentences. She passed it to her son Alexei, whose suffering became the family's doom. Rasputin, the mystic healer, entered their lives because of that single genetic flaw, a flaw born from generations of intermarriage. When the Romanovs were executed in a cellar in 1918, the dynasty that once claimed divine right was silenced by human biology. And what of Queen Victoria herself, the so-called grandmother of Europe? She had married her cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg, uniting yet another branch of royal kin. Their descendants filled the thrones of Britain, Germany, Russia, and Spain. Through her lineage, hemophilia spread like an invisible plague, striking her daughter's sons across the continent. Princes bled to death from nosebleeds. Young heirs died from minor bruises. The newspapers called it the curse of the royal blood. To the common people, it was poetic justice. To the women who carried it, it was agony. They had been raised to believe their bodies were sacred vessels of destiny, only to learn that those bodies carried death. As the modern age unfolded, monarchy itself began to fade, replaced by republics, wars, and science. Yet the ghosts of those women remained, etched in portraits, recorded in letters, immortalized in their suffering. Historians now read their genealogies like autopsies, lines folding back upon themselves, names repeating, chromosomes collapsing under royal ambition. The beauty of the palaces cannot hide the statistics of decay. Every crown was a mask, every wedding a warning. But beneath the tragedy lies something more human than political folly: the desperate need to control fate. These kings and queens were terrified of losing what made them special. They feared that love outside the palace walls would dissolve the illusion of divinity. So they turned inward, closing the circle until the circle became a noose. Their daughters were born into that tightening loop, each generation breathing a little less. And still, the music played, the candles burned, the vows were spoken. No one dared break the pattern until nature did it for them. By the mid-1900s, genetic science had unveiled the full horror of what centuries of pure unions had done. In universities, professors used the Habsburgs as case studies. Photographs of Charles II's twisted jaw appeared in medical journals beside diagrams of recessive traits. What had once been painted as holiness was now understood as pathology. The world looked back in disbelief. How could empires of intellect and art have been so blind? The answer was simple: power makes its own religion. For them, blood was a creed, and the women were its martyrs. If you walk today through the galleries of Madrid or Vienna, you can still meet their eyes. Velázquez's Infanta Margaret looks out with her doll-like stare, forever 5 years old, forever burdened by the secret in her veins. Nearby hang portraits of Maria Anna, of Isabella, of countless princesses whose smiles conceal generations of suffering. Tourists snap photos, charmed by the beauty, unaware that behind every brushstroke lies the echo of pain passed from mother to daughter. The colors have faded, but the curse endures, in the history books, in the DNA of forgotten bones. Yet the story of history's most inbred women is not merely a cautionary tale about genetics. It is a mirror held up to human pride. It shows how civilizations, in their quest for immortality, choose vanity over vitality. It reminds us that purity, when worshipped too deeply, becomes poison. For these women were not villains. They were victims of the myths that made them royal. They were born into cages gilded with lies, told they were divine, yet treated as breeding stock, dressed in gold, yet deprived of choice. Their tragedy is timeless because the desire for control never dies. Every era invents its own form of purity, its own way of drawing lines around worth. Theirs was blood. Ours may be status, wealth, or ideology. The curse changes costume, but never disappears. And so the final image is this: a vast ballroom lit by chandeliers, empty now, dust floating where once there was laughter. The echoes of waltzes fade into silence. On the walls hang the faces of queens and princesses, beautiful, fragile, haunting. Their lineage ended not with rebellion, but with exhaustion. Nature reclaimed what arrogance had defied. The blood that once crowned them now rests quietly in the earth, indistinguishable from the peasants they once ruled. But if you listen closely, you can almost hear them. Whispers beneath the marble floors, voices soft yet insistent. Remember us not for our crowns, but for our cost. Because the true curse was never the blood itself. It was the belief that it could ever be pure.